Now, just the other day, Collider did an interview with J.J. Abrams, writer and director of The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, the two bookend films of the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And in it, they asked him if the sequels would have benefited from having a plan from the beginning. And yeah, I know this is a topic I've kind of beaten to death already, not to mention pretty much everyone, even the staunchest sequel defender, has now accepted and will acknowledge there was no real overall plan for the films. J.J. Abrams even basically admits that in this interview by in no way trying to counter or argue against the question, and instead, in a somewhat roundabout way, he explains what happened and why with the sequels where the story went wrong. And I do think there's some interesting things to take away from this and discuss, and not just about the sequel trilogy, but about storytelling in general, which is something I love doing here on this channel. Anyway, he sort of gave a three-part response, or at least that's how Collider broke it down. So what I'll do is just read one part at a time and give you my thoughts on it, and then move on to the next one. And if you're interested in checking out the whole interview or the whole article, a link to it will be in the description below. But anyway, the first thing he said was, I've been involved in a number of projects that have been, in most cases, series that have ideas that begin the thing where you feel like you know where it's going to go, and sometimes it's an actor who comes in, other times it's a relationship that, as written, doesn't quite work. And things that you think are going to just be so well received, just crash and burn. And other things that you think like, oh, that's a small moment or that's a one episode character, suddenly become a hugely important part of the story. I feel like what I've learned as a lesson a few times now, and it's something that, especially in this pandemic year working with writers, has become clear, the lesson is that you have to plan things as best you can, and you always need to be able to respond to the unexpected. And the unexpected can come in all sorts of forms, and I do think that there's nothing more important than knowing where you're going. Okay, so again here as someone who loves to tell stories on this channel, though obviously on a much, much smaller scale than something like the sequel trilogy or a series like Lost that Abrams worked on, I still do get exactly what he's talking about at the start of his comments. That you just never can be certain ahead of time what the audience is going to latch onto or gravitate towards, what characters they're going to love and which ones they're not going to like so much and care little about, if at all, or which storylines they want to see delved into to the fullest and which ones they could care less if you ever touch on again. And with my own stories that I do here on YouTube, I have the luxury, or sometimes curse, of writing each part week to week. I literally see the response to one part before I even write the next. And so I can then know which parts of the story or which characters people want more from and which ones they don't, and then adjust accordingly. Though then there are also times people get very interested in a character or part of the story I didn't really anticipate, and then I can't go back and add more to that story to set up a bigger or a better or more intricate story for that character or plotline. And so I think something like this may have happened with the sequel trilogy, likely happened with the sequel trilogy. I don't know, going back to The Force Awakens, that Rey's parents were actually supposed to be such a big mystery that so many people were interested in. I don't think J.J. Abrams and company, everyone behind the scenes responsible for its creation, anticipated that reaction. I think the idea from the start was to make her a nobody, and that The Force Awakens tries to heavily imply that, but does a sort of bad job at it. And yes, I know Daisy Ridley not too long ago said that at one point, very early on, they were toying around with the idea of making Rey a Kenobi, but then she said they settled on the nobody idea before that eventually changed in The Rise of Skywalker to a Palpatine. And also keep in mind, years back now, shortly after Episode 7 came out, Daisy Ridley said that she was surprised to learn that the whole Rey's parents thing was a big deal, was a mystery at all. She thought it was obvious who her parents were right in the film, and if she thought it was obvious, that means she thought it was clear, it was implied that she was a nobody, because that's what she was supposed to be. And likely she wasn't the only one who expected that answer to be obvious of those making these films. And so, again, I think that's what The Force Awakens was trying to tell us, especially when you consider Maz Kanata is telling Rey that the belonging she seeks is ahead and not behind, meaning she's trying to tell us, the movie is trying to tell us who she will become is more important than where she comes from. But that clearly wasn't enough. The movie needed to be a bit more blunt, it seems. And I know some will say that there were other clues pointing elsewhere, leading us astray, which I do agree with. Again, it did a sloppy job of painting her as a nobody, especially when the Skywalker saber calls out to her and basically shows her the Skywalker family history That heavily implies she has something to do with the Skywalkers. But the thing here is, even if they intended her to be a nobody from the very start, once they got past that Kenobi idea and settled on it, which again Daisy Ridley did say was the case, she said she was supposed to be a nobody from the start, they still had an opportunity to do something else with the story or to focus elsewhere after they saw the way everyone reacted to The Force Awakens, how intrigued everyone was by the mystery that maybe wasn't supposed to be a mystery around Rey's parents. Furthermore, there were two other things everyone seemed to want to know after Episode 7, and those were who or what is Snoke, what is his deal, as well as why is Luke on that island. Problem is, Rian Johnson wrote Episode 8 before The Force Awakens even came out, before he ever saw fan reaction to it, and saw what they responded to and maybe what they didn't. He even asked for some things in The Force Awakens to be changed to fit what he had in mind for his part of the story, like the ending with Luke. He was originally going to be found by Rey meditating with rocks floating around him, but Johnson wanted that changed. And so having written The Last Jedi before seeing reaction to The Force Awakens and by not adjusting much of anything to it, to that reaction, we've even heard that most everything from his very first draft of Episode 8 was kept intact. The Last Jedi didn't in any way adjust to what fans wanted or expected from that movie. In fact, Johnson has basically said before that it doesn't matter what fans want, that you have to do what's best for the story. And I don't think he's entirely wrong there. I think if you want to tell stories in a franchise like Star Wars that's been around for so long and has well-established ideas and lore and expectations from fans, you have to learn to walk a fine line between giving fans what they want and giving them what they don't know they want. You do have to surprise them and subvert expectations from time to time. Problem is, in this case, with the sequels and Episode 8, it was very, very clear that people or fans expected certain things from The Last Jedi, and not because they're entitled fans and demand the stories they want or else, but because The Force Awakens led them to believe that's what they were going to get. That movie, intended or not, made Rey's parents into a huge mystery that everyone made theories about for 2 years and everyone wanted cool answers to. And the way that mystery is addressed in The Last Jedi, and it is addressed there, comes off feeling very meta, like it was added in there just to tell fans who she is and not because Rey herself wanted to know or didn't know. Keep in mind, at no point in The Force Awakens is it implied Rey does not know who her parents are. She's just waiting for them to come back. Yet in The Last Jedi, she suddenly wants to know who her parents are, and somehow Kylo Ren knows. And not only does he know, but he knows that she wants to know. But anyway, let's move on to the next part where Abrams said, "There are projects that I've worked on where we had some ideas, but we hadn't worked through them enough. Sometimes we had some ideas, but then we weren't allowed to do them the way we wanted to. I've had all sorts of situations where you plan things in a certain way, and you suddenly find yourself doing something that's 180 degrees different. And then sometimes it works really well and you feel like, wow, that really came together. And other times you think, oh my God, I can't believe this is where we are. And sometimes when it's not working out, it's because it's what you planned. And other times when it's not working out, it's because you didn't have a plan." And I mean, this certainly sounds like he's talking about the sequel trilogy, but doesn't want to expressly say it and potentially anger anyone or anger Disney or anger Rian Johnson or whoever it might be. He's saying you sometimes have some ideas, but maybe you don't work them out enough, which feels like the case with The Force Awakens. A whole lot of ideas thrown out there, but maybe no solid answers behind them. And then he's talking about how sometimes you're not allowed to do the things you want or things turn out unexpectedly. He says that sometimes you find yourself 180 degrees away from what you intended, which is probably how he felt going into The Rise of Skywalker, coming back after The Last Jedi took the story in a whole other direction than he thought it would go. And that sometimes it still comes together nicely, but other times you just can't believe the mess you end up with. And again, this could certainly apply to The Rise of Skywalker. He then talks about how sometimes, though, this is the result of not having a plan, yet other times it can be the result of having a plan, which sort of leads to the third comment where he says, "You just never really know, but having a plan, I have learned in some cases the hard way, is the most critical thing, because otherwise you don't know what you're setting up. You don't know what to emphasize, because if you don't know the inevitable of the story, you're just as good as your last sequence or effect or joke or whatever, but you want to be leading to something inevitable." And I do more or less agree with him, because if you're going to tell a story, you should have some sort of plan. Especially in the case of the sequel trilogy, where you know fans out there are going to be very critical of the story you come up with. They're going to look to pick it apart, even if they like it. And even if what you're writing is something brand new with no sort of fan expectations around it, you should still try to have an idea or plan of what you want your story to be or be about. Otherwise, it can easily end up a meandering mess. And personally, I always have at least a vague outline of how I want events to play out in my story, and there's always a certain ending I'm aiming for. But sometimes the characters don't allow you to get there, not if you're being true to them. And being true to the characters, I think, almost always makes for a better story than betraying them or railroading them to the ending you envision. It makes for a far more natural and organic feeling story to let the characters change the story if that's what feels the most realistic. George R.R. Martin, for example, who wrote the Game of Thrones books, I feel like he's someone who lets his characters almost completely dictate the story. Like, he lets them just run wild, which is why he's now struggling to finish that series, as well as why so many didn't like Season 8 of Game of Thrones. Because the beauty of Game of Thrones is it doesn't feel contrived at all. It feels very real. Like, again, the characters are controlling and determining the story all by themselves. Like, we're just following real events. Like, this is a reality TV show set in a fantasy world. Problem is, it's nearly impossible to end a story that's carried on that way for so long without things starting to now feel contrived to at least some extent when you start to wrap it up and shoot for an ending. Because to get to that ending for all these characters and plot threads simultaneously, unless you're extremely brilliant or just very, very lucky, you're going to now have to steer some characters to where you need them in order to get your ending. And when you start to do that, when you start to steer or railroad characters after several books or seasons of a show, of essentially letting them roam free without doing any of that, at least none of that that's noticeable, it ends up sticking out like a sore thumb and feels off to the audience or reader, even if they're not entirely sure what is now wrong with it or can't articulate it. They can still feel something is wrong or just not right suddenly, especially when you try to bring them all together, all these characters that you've had through all these seasons, for just a 6-episode final season like Season 8 of Game of Thrones did. But then there's sort of the exact opposite way of doing things, which is working completely backwards, where you set a very concrete ending, where you say, this is how my story will end no matter what, and I will make sure the characters get there, which is how I feel Rian Johnson works. I think he had a very clear vision in his head about what he wanted The Last Jedi to be, how he wanted it to end, and what major story beats he wanted along the way, and then he wrote making sure those characters got there. And in my opinion, this isn't necessarily a bad or wrong way to write. I'm of the belief you do whatever you have to do to craft an enjoyable story. If people like it, that's great, so be it. And though I have my reasons for believing Rian Johnson is someone who works backwards or works this way, and I've discussed them before in other videos, the fact that he wrote a murder mystery that so many seem to enjoy, that being, of course, Knives Out, it says to me he does have one of those minds that's really good at working backwards, at having a set endpoint, and then spinning a web of intrigue in reverse. And the problem with working that way in regards to The Last Jedi is I don't think he thought too much about how his ending to that film would impact the next and final part of not only the sequel trilogy, but the whole Skywalker saga, which goes back to what J.J. Abrams said about sometimes being in a position of, oh my god, how did we get here, and what can we do to salvage this? But anyway, here to wrap it up, I do think J.J. Abrams said quite a bit without really saying anything at all in this interview. I think it's clear he has some regrets when it comes to the sequels and what they turned out to be. That he thinks they could have been better, and that the approach they took wasn't an optimal one, to say the least. But that he's not going to come out and say those things. Again, he's not going to anger or alienate anyone he may have worked with along the way. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what, if anything, you make of what J.J. Abrams had to say in this interview. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.